The 2021 season of Nat Talks is made possible by presenting sponsor, the Downing Family Foundation, and media partners KPVS, the public media station serving San Diego and Imperial counties. So finally, get to introduce someone who I wish I lived closer to, because I find his research fascinating, and every interaction I've had with him, he just seems like the friendliest soul on the face of the planet. And but unfortunately, I don't live in Australia anymore, and that's where Luis lives. So it's amazing that we're getting this opportunity to do this and have this presentation from the future in Australia. The reason why I came in contact with Luis was because the museum's working on this project around San Diego's canyons, and we're interested in sort of examples of implementation of community science in the urban landscape from around the world, like best practices. Where are people doing interesting things with community science that we can learn from as we sort of try to implement in a project that could take place in San Diego's urban canyons? And just in the process of Googling and trying to find the who's who of research in urban ecology and urban green spaces, Luis's name came up over and over again, and he's an entomologist. And so that just automatically put a check mark beside his name that meant I needed to find out more. So we invited Luis to give a conversation to one of our brown bag seminars, and it was amazing. And I think you'll find it be amazing tonight. Dr. Luis Mata is an ecologist with a keen interest in insects, urban environment, citizen science, and science communication. He's a researcher in the School of Forestry, the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences at University of Melbourne, where he's collaborating on a range of projects seeking to provide evidence of the ecological and community engagement benefits of urban greening actions. He's also associated with the People, Nature, Place Research Program at RMIT University Center for Urban Research, where he's researching the social and ecological benefits of wildlife gardening. Luis conducted his PhD research on Heteroptera ecology, which are the true bugs, which is the same thing I did my dissertation on. Again, another reason why I love Luis. But also ecology, biodiversity, and conservation in the Department of Animal Biology at the University of Barcelona. But during that time, he spent 6 months in Australia collaborating with the Australian Research Council Linkage Project on a project that was called Ecosystem Services from Large Urban Green Spaces. And so this is, what I find fascinating about Luis's research is how large urban green spaces we might think of as being, really too cared for to support biodiversity, but what his research is telling us that it is much more complex than that, and that there are reasons for hope. So with that, Luis, I'm going to turn it over to you, my friend.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks, Michael, for that presentation. It's such a pleasure to be able to be here today, and the privilege of giving this talk, and also the privilege of collaborating with you and your colleagues in the Canyons project in San Diego. And I'm really looking forward to this collaboration and how it's going to develop across the years. Yes, I want to say that I've been working on the space, as Michael was saying, for about the space of bringing nature back into the cities for about 7 years now, since I've been living here in Australia. But with insects a little bit longer. As I said, I started with an interest in Heteroptera bugs. But even before that, and I hope it kind of comes across in the talk, I was engaging with nature through photography for the longest time now, ever since I can remember. And it started with flowers, actually, just this idea of being able to take macro photos, getting really close to the flowers. And then through that, and again, I think it's going to come across in the talk today, I kind of started to see all these interactions that were happening between insects and flowers, as you can see here in this photo. And that's something that has permeated my life and my research and my engagement with people. So yeah, that's a really kind of like strong interest of mine. And that's why I guess that we all live in cities, right? Or near cities. We engage with cities, and cities are just going to increasingly grow and expand in the future. So that's why I think it's so relevant to kind of like make sure that we have that nature in cities, make sure that if we go to a local park, we'd be able to observe something like an insect or a pollinator interacting with our local flowers. So, you know, that's going to be permeated through the talk. And but now I would love to hear more from you, actually. And the next 4 slides are actually for you. And as Michael was saying, if you could, you know, get that chat option in your link working, and just start sharing with me and with all of us what kind of feelings, what kind of things you think about when you see a photo like this. And so I'm going to open my chat box, and there'll be 4 of these. So feel free to start commenting, and I'll track them and maybe speak some of them out loud as I go. Excellent. So yeah, I'm going to just start reading them out loud. We have pollen and pollination, ecosystem health. Excellent. Pollinator hard at work. Drenched. Excellent. Is this something you might be able to see in San Diego or in wherever you live? This kind of bees? Do they look like your bees, or do they look quite different? Pollen pants. Good one, Terry. I like that. It's different, huh? Yeah. Excellent. I'm gonna move into the next one. Not a honeybee. Very good. What about this one? This image as not just the bee, but the flower and the interaction. How is it different from the one before, if at all? Yeah, it's definitely in the daisy family. Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. This is excellent. I'm going to move into the next one since we have 2 more to go, and maybe I'll be interesting to see now how is this one then different now? And I'll flag that this exercise is really going to help us get some ideas flowing that will stay with you for the rest of the talk. Oh, it's definitely a bee, not a bee fly. John, just in case. No, not a hornet. It's definitely a bee. Excellent, thanks. Well observed, Michael. The marginal cells. Have a good eye for that one. All right, I'm going to move into the last one, which has already actually come up in the chat, right? Someone already mentioned this species. Yeah, that's right. But Ashley, that's incredibly well observed, non-native, but that would depend on where it was taken, right? It's not native to where you are potentially, but it might be native somewhere else. Excellent. All right. Well, feel free to keep popping them in if they come to you. I'm gonna finish them up. Gonna move into the next slide. So then just trying to summarize quickly this little interactive experience that we just went through with this question, right? Which themes drew your attention the most? There were a lot of themes there. I'm going to summarize what I have, and I've been changing this every time I give a presentation. So I find that there's obviously a theme of pollination that is very obvious. They're all bees. There was pollen involved in the legs and in the body through the hairs of the bee. Obviously, there was a flower providing the pollen. So I think that was very clear for most everyone. But what about it? It's probably a misnomer, but it's something that is known as invasion ecology, right? And it came up when we mentioned the honeybee is a non-native. So I hope that now, if you kind of think back of all of them, maybe it would have made us thought, where was that flower from? Where was that photo taken? And in the context of where that flower was the insect, the bee, native or not? And if it was not, then we have something about invasion ecology, right? Like something that technically doesn't belong or has spread beyond its own abilities through human action. But one that really fascinates me, and I hope that, and it was so lovely to see that the acknowledgement of Indigenous culture and First Nations that Michael did at the beginning. But there's definitely something about then thinking of Indigenous culture, because it doesn't matter where we are in the world. It's interesting to think that some of those plants were there before, and some of those insects were before people. So in some contexts, what we see is really connected to kind of deep history and deep culture that we sometimes in our kind of modern life tend to forget. I'll say more about that in the context of Australia through the talk. And then a little bit beyond pollination itself, there's this idea then of plant-insect interactions, right? Like for other flower visiting insects, it's going to be about visiting a flower or a plant for different reasons. So you could more broadly generalize that by seeing a photo like the ones that I showed before, there's a really deep interconnection between insects and plants. And that's something that is going to, again, permeate through the talk. And I hope you keep that in mind. But obviously, and finally, there was a connection with the pattern that a few of you mentioned, the aesthetic component of it that I obviously did on purpose, that cannot escape our attention. See how beautifully patterned some of the flowers were, and how beautifully patterned some of the insects were, the bees, and the connection between those, in this case with yellow and black. But it's just something that probably does not have an explanation. It's just something that we appreciate and think of as beautiful. Excellent. So thanks for that once again. And then through the next few minutes, I'm going to move through what I'm calling some key idea and concepts that I'll be discussing. They're based on my research and that of my colleagues and my peers more internationally. And they would lead then to a second part of the talk that is more around actual on-ground projects that we have been doing to put this into, to kind of like put this knowledge somehow into action and bring nature back into cities. So this first idea here that I hope that we're all familiar with is the idea that urbanization somehow is not good for biodiversity. Many people have looked at this. The way that I approached it back in 2014 was to look at a big insect community, 142 species, and then show that when you look at the whole insect community, there's a very strong negative response as you move here in a gradient of urbanization. So basically, insects as a community are much better off when there's no urban context. But then in this other plot here to the right, we start seeing that that is species specific. So for some reason, right, there are some insects, each line of this is one insect species, that are really deeply affected by urbanization, whereas other ones, they just remain flat. So they're good. It doesn't really matter. And there's a whole range of things in between. I think that's really important to keep in mind that, so urbanization is definitely bad for some species. And then we won't go as far as saying it's good, but it's more like neutral, which means that we have a space, a scope to act and do something about it. If we were to learn, how can we keep it in the safe space for insect and other animals? And then, of course, I want you to probably start thinking about this. Why does it affect some species much more than others? It's something that is an active area of research. Now with this slide, again, I want to kind of like get you engaged, thinking very quickly, just as I introduce the slide. There's a pattern here that is not only unique to urban environments here in the middle, but, and here when you kind of get a close-up of our suburbs, but it's a pattern that permeates any kind of context, any kind of landscape, from rivers, wetlands, agricultural environments, forests, even archipelagos and coral reef, right? And of course, it's this idea that fragmentation is quite ubiquitous. And it definitely happens in urban environments. And what that actually means is that as opposed to us, we can perfectly live in our houses and in our suburbs, the rest of biodiversity is living in these fragmented patches. And they have to overcome these barriers to communicate, to disperse, to be in touch with one another. So that's something that is definitely has to be in the back of our mind when we think about urban nature, is where are the animals living, where are the plants living, and how are they communicating, how are they connecting? Now then, this next slide just brings up the idea, right, that in those patches which are good, those fragmented patches that are good for biodiversity, they're going to have different levels, different qualities to them. They're not all the same. So as you can imagine, there will be a gradient that depends on management in this case. So you can go all the way from a remnant, which in the context of, for example, I believe, say in the context of San Diego, we would be thinking of something like the Canyonlands. Some of them still have remnant vegetation, but then you can move all across this gradient into something like a managed park that requires a lot of input, a lot of resources. And obviously our gardens are normally they're heavily manicured, all the way to something like a green infrastructure, like a green roof, where you really need to have everything really controlled for it to work. So this just speaks to the quality of these different patches. And then here's something that I'm really excited to share with you, because potentially this is something different that we haven't heard before. At least I hope that I can contribute to some kind of new thinking on this. Is this idea of networks. We all know that we're very well connected in networks, social networks, transport networks. Even our brains is just a whole network of neurons, right? But this is exactly the same that happens out there in our urban nature. The different patches that I was mentioning before, each one of them has a different network of ecological interactions. In this case, you can see here interactions between plants and birds, and in this case, monkeys and other things. But of course, in each one, it's very different. So having a tiny patch will have a less structure, a less complex network than a big patch, for example. And so it's this idea that it's not just species out there in the patches, it's this whole network of interactions, and each network is different in each patch. And so I guess that all of us would be immediately thinking, oh, I want to have a healthy network. I want to have a complex, interesting, diverse network as opposed to, a less complex one. So how do we make these networks interesting? And then hopefully that brings it back home to our 4 photos, right? So in each one of those networks, you're going to get different types of interactions. And so right now, really zooming in into something that makes sense to us, just the photos that we were discussing before, you can think about each one of these plants contributing to those networks. And then depending on what kind of plant we have, you will generate, or you will have some different types of interactions. So in this case, in a very simplistic way that I'm showing you here, in your grading of plants from introduced to indigenous or locally native, if you prefer, and same for the pollinators, you get these 4 very distinct, interesting type of interactions. So at least in the context of Melbourne and Australia, for example, before the colonial period, which is very recent here, only 200, 300 years ago, every interaction, every single interaction here 300 years ago was of this type, the indigenous that I was showing you before, okay? And then it's only after plants were starting to be brought from elsewhere and insects from elsewhere that you get the other 3, right? So I think most of you would think or are used to this idea that, of course, you have an introduced with an introduced animal plant. In this case, in Melbourne, this is a species from South Africa that invaded or got here recently. And this is a South African daisy. So obviously, They find each other here in Melbourne and they're happy with each other because they're both from originally South Africa. Sorry. But these other two are more complex, right? When you start getting things like the European honeybee in Australia interacting with one of our most kind of like charismatic flowers, the Banksia flowers, and very, very good at extracting resources from it. But then our native bees, this tiny one, are getting really good at extracting resources from what otherwise it's just denominated a weed, like a little daisy weed that actually gets removed by managers because they just don't want them. But bees are actually really good at interacting with them. So you get all these types of interactions. But one thing that we have been actually very actively studying, and I'm really happy to share with you, is that given the option in urban environments, at least here in Melbourne, the preferred type of interaction is the indigenous. And that's something that we are really excited to be able to show, because that's what people really want to know. What plant should I plant in my garden if I want to foster indigenous biodiversity in my garden? And city managers, like municipality council managers, they're asking the same questions. Where should we invest our budget? What kind of plants should we buy if we want to promote biodiversity? And so we can start providing help and evidence for some of these issues. Now, having said that, I want to show you another little bit of research that we have been doing. And in this case, you get a whole range of insects, of indigenous insects in this study. It's the same data set as before that we used to inform the slide before. But in this case, you can see here in this plot that it's true. All of the insects groups are interacting with the locally indigenous plants, but yet they also interact with non-native plants. This has led us to believe that there's definitely something about novel resource utilization, and there's opportunities to also use non-indigenous plants. So it's not all black, white, and black, right? It's not just, doesn't need to be that kind of like polarized. There's options here to work across the whole spectra of plant origin. But again, and I want to leave you with this idea, right? Like, what plants should we be planting? And I guess you all have ideas in this, because obviously people plant plants for different reasons, and not only to attract insects, but potentially to attract birds and other animals. But maybe some people are thinking of the soil. And beyond that, we all have our own aesthetic, cultural, and values that will affect that decision, not to mention climate change, adaptation to different type of environments, water use, resources, etc. So it's a really interesting, complex question, and we're just trying to contribute to parts of it. So if we really want to make this happen, to bring nature back into cities, and we know that greening is a big component of it, so planting plants, we try to look at what are the different dimensions that, as I was mentioning, that could affect that. And we were very lucky to work with a range of incredibly talented indigenous scholars that were happy to share with us their thoughts on this. And one of the key things that came out of it that I want to share with you is that beyond all these kind of like more traditional ideas or facets, they strongly encourage us to think that the cultural value of species was as important as all the other ones. So basically saying, if you want to bring out this kind of like this bringing back, what are you bringing back? Are you bringing back the indigenous, the First Nation, the actual deep value of species? Then you have to think about their origin. And that's sort of an argument to also contribute to the idea that local indigenous plants and insects have a lot of value. On that note, I would really encourage you to have a look at my indigenous colleague, Zena Kumston, who developed this whole resource of indigenous plants here in Melbourne. And maybe in your case, it's just the potential of thinking of whether this could be done for where you live, San Diego or Arizona or California, elsewhere. The knowledge of what are the indigenous plants and whether they have connections with indigenous biodiversity, but also connections with indigenous culture. So it's a really pleasure to have been able to work in this collaboration. And it's something that I just strongly encourage anyone to kind of like seek out, like this connection with the indigenous local culture. But I might then stop it here, sort of kind of like midpoint talk. And in case Michael would like to bring in any potential questions, and also for you, if you're happy to just think about this question and share it in the chat as well at the same time. What species will you bring back? I said here San Diego, but anywhere you live, it's equally valid. So.
Yeah, thanks, Luis. We've just got, at least right now, 2 questions in the chat. One's from Ashley Salas, and she referencing that, you know, there's this Save the Bees movement, but I mean, we know it in the United States, but I think it's more widespread than that. But it's often centered around colony collapse disorder and honeybees. But, you know, everybody's trying to extend that to native bees as well. Do you have any indication whether those efforts to save honeybees, where honeybees are not native, have affected native bee species?
You know, it's a really excellent question, and it's a true dilemma. This how honeybees actually kind of like take that role, that big umbrella role of bees. So on that note, I will just say that I think it's really important to move beyond that and to think locally, whatever you are, what other bee species might be out there that would also need protection, would also need your attention, would also need efforts from people to get interested and think about how can we best do to conserve them. So I definitely think that we should be moving beyond the kind of like approach of just focusing on the honeybee.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that there's a number of research papers on the impact of honeybees versus you know, on native bee fauna, et cetera. And Ashley, I just dropped something into the chat that you might find interesting. The second question we got is: a network the same thing as a food web but discrete, and how do you measure its boundaries?
Oh, thanks for that question. I love it. Yes, so like a food web is a realization of a network, for sure. It is a type of network, but not the other way around. Not all networks are food webs. So I hope that makes sense. Food webs have a very particular directionality, as in there's always something that eats something else. Most of the time, there's no I eat you in return kind of thing. Maybe humans have a little bit of that going on with some species, where we might, you know, some species might kill us and then we might go and kill that species, as we have, you know, co-evolved with big predators throughout time. But for the most part, it's very directional. So yeah, a food web is sort of a directional network.
And then a last minute addition here is, can you talk a little bit about the importance of wild bees, and also what other pollinators should we consider that we might not usually think about?
Yeah, great. So I think, and this would apply to any context, the local pollinators, the local bees, native bees, will have co-evolved very closely with the local plants. That's for sure. So you might even go as far as asserting that if there were no local pollinators, some plants will not have means of reproducing. So that's a really tight connection there, that it's just invaluable. So that's an invaluable value in local species. And then the second part of the question is, yes, of course, there's all kinds of other type of pollinators that are not bees, including flies and of course butterflies, beetles. So there's a whole range. Obviously, we can move beyond insects to think about birds. And at least in the Australian context, or at least in the Western Australian context, I hope you be kind of like interested to know that we actually get mammals pollinator, mammal pollinator. So tiny marsupials that go into big flowers because we have very big flowers there. And so it's kind of interesting that plants get pollinated by mammals. So yeah, there's a whole range of other things that are attracted to flowers that are of value and are very interesting.
Great, and I think we'll stop it there, but don't worry, Maurice. We'll have time for more questions at the end, but we're going to let Luis continue on here, and we'll come back around to your question. So don't worry. Thanks, Luis. Back to you.
Thank you. All right, so I hope you had a chance to think about what kind of species you will bring back, because I'm going to discuss some practical studies where we have been trying to look at what insects we would like to bring back into Melbourne. And this is sort of a journey that started with this project. That I'm grateful for Edward Wilson's kind of like not naming insects the little things that run the world, because I kind of like my colleagues and I kind of nicked that idea and said, well, if we want to work with urban insects and we're going to work with local government and local municipalities to study insects, then we want to find out, what are the little things that run the city. And so, yeah, we did a really, really kind of like thorough, deep, careful study of insects here in Melbourne. Just to give you a sense, this is what the boundaries of the city of Melbourne, which is just one of the, I think, 35 cities that are part of metropolitan Melbourne. And of course, it's a lot of matrix here, including a big port, industry, a big CBD with skyscrapers and whatnot. But there's a whole network of green spaces. And that's where we did our study. So again, you can see here the pattern that I was discussing before, the fragmentation and the different quality that potentially have these different spaces have. And then we took this network approach. So in each one of the green spaces, we built networks of interactions between plants and insects. So we documented over 2,000 of them, 130 plants, to find out that of these 130 plants that we could actually survey, which basically every single plant species in this area, in these parks, we found almost 600 insect species. And that in itself, well, this insects that live on plants, right? Does not include things on their bark or in the soil or in the leaf litter. That would have been more, but still quite an impressive number for such an urban, inner city, very dense urban kind of like context. So we're really excited about that. And here's just a little breakdown. Hopefully it's something that you would expect. There's a lot of beetles, but look at the amount of parasitoid wasps that no one knew anything about them before we did the study. Like whether there was a single parasitoid wasp in Melbourne, we didn't know what that was. But yeah, so it's a really interesting breakdown of the different groups. And then here presented more in the way that we want to show the world what we found is this categorization of the plants, right, that I was discussing before. So we started with a kind of like a top level approach. We just divided the plants in what we call kind of like functional groups, or like what people actually get to plant in the gardens, municipalities. So that's like a lawn, or whether it's a mid-story or a tree canopy. And then whether the origin was here in yellow, non-native. Native means that it's not from Victoria or from Melbourne. The plant is still from Australia, but it came from another state. So think about maybe a plant from New York planted in San Diego, right? So something that came from the other side of the continent. And then the plant species that were purely local, indigenous. And I think the story is very clear. You probably would have thought, oh, it's going to be in a tree. It doesn't matter its origin. And it definitely matters. So the capacity of non-native trees to attract insects is way less than if you have an indigenous tree. But even the mid-story, it's larger than the tree. And that's quite surprising, given that most cities in the world only do lawn and they only do a tree canopy. So another way of looking at the story is, this is how your city will look if you only had lawns. I really love to see what you're thinking right now in your minds. What kind of adjectives come to your mind when you think of a city that would only have lawns? So this is what we would reach. That's the number of species on average that we will reach of insects. And then think about how more rich it gets as you do different types and you start including preserving, conserving, or restoring your indigenous plants. But the story gets more interesting when you move. So now we're going to unpack, we're going to look at detail at just the mid-story. So that's what we have here. So all these groups here down below are the mid-story groups, so different types of plants. So you have forb, lilioids, graminoids, shrub. I hope they all make sense. But basically, they're just different types of plants that you can use. And then you repeat that story between native, non-native, native, and indigenous. And then what we found here, and look at then the same story. So if you just used non-native forbs, so basically daisies like daisy-looking flashy flowers, you reach more than just using lawns. But look at the difference if you were to base your planting on, say, indigenous grasses, which is exactly the type of vegetation that was indigenous to here, at least in my context. But this story could repeat itself in any other context, I suppose. So it's really impressive how we now can direct counsel in their planting choices, not at the species level, but based on the broad types of plants they might bring into the city and how that's going to contribute to the insect biodiversity of the city. And so beyond the science, we're really happy that the City of Melbourne was really collaborative with us. They transformed the data set of this study, all our findings, into an interactive website, and you can access it through that web address there. And it's a really cool interactive showcase of our findings and of the insects we found and of the study methodology and everything else. So I definitely encourage you to visit this. It shows a lot of potential of how government can interact with scientists to do things that are useful for everyone. But then we also proposed to the city to develop a sort of like a science communication type of book. And then we showcased what my colleagues and I thought were the 30 most amazing insects that live in Melbourne. And I'm so excited. This is a resource that people are using. Their objective was to have one in each school across the whole metropolitan area. So kids around the city are using this book to find out about insects in their city. It's a really, really exciting output from the study. Now I'm going to move on into a different study. We call this one Pollinator Observatories. People involved here were myself and a student who did most of the hard work and got really the pleasure of working and learning about pollinators, but also the pleasure of working with in this case, Janet Bolitho. And she's not a scientist. She's what you would call sort of a community practitioner. And so she leads a group of people who are sort of a friends type group. And what they have done is just beyond amazing. They transformed a green space that used to be, and I hope I'm going to use the appropriate words, it used to be a rubbish tip, a dump site for garbage. Yeah, that's right. In the middle of the city, 30 years ago in Melbourne, there was a site that used to be a rubbish tip. People will dump their garbage there. And my emphasis in that is because 30 years after, at the time that this study is done, it's one of the most beautiful places in the city. And if you were to visit, you would swear that this place, it's a remnant vegetation. It's like what Melbourne used to look like. And so what they've done is truly impressive. And so it's a really privilege to work with them and collaborate and develop this idea of let's try to now see whether we have also, after 30 years, we have brought back the plants, have we brought back the pollinators as well? And they were really interested in doing that with community science. We called it back then citizen science, with community science to be able to engage people with this activity. So I'll show you what we found.
Hey, Luis, real quick. I'm sorry. There was a question that came up in the comments that I know confounded me when I've heard you speak before, and I can't remember the answer. Otherwise, I would have dealt with it. native versus indigenous. And I just wanted to capture that before we continued on and people had confusion.
Oh, yeah, thanks. No worries. Yeah. So what I've been calling indigenous is when it's absolutely local from whatever area you are. And so obviously that would be a context. It could be indigenous. You'll have to give a context, right? So indigenous to a city or indigenous to a bioregion, a state. There's always going to have to be a geographic context. And I think that's interchangeable with locally native, at least in my understanding. But at least in Australia, sometimes we say native to regionally native, I should have said, to say something that is from Australia, but not from a given smaller region. So there's a lot of plants here in Melbourne that that came from Perth or from Brisbane or from Sydney. So they're not from here, they're not locally from Melbourne, they're still from Australia, and most people will call those native. So that's why I mentioned that maybe you have an example of a plant from Florida or from New York that should only be in the East Coast, but maybe someone planted in the West Coast. And that would be an example of a regionally native North American plant, I suppose. I hope that makes sense. If not, I'm happy to.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. Appreciate it. And I mean, people from California will get this because we've got a ton of ceanothus plants, California lilacs in California, but only some grow in our area. So they're native to California, but the indigenous ones are the ones that do well in our area. So.
Beautiful. Excellent. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Thanks, Luis.
So in the case of this study in Westgate Park, so this is the area that they changed. There used to be a rubbish tip. It's called Westgate Park, and it is this area that you can clearly see in green. Like, just look at it. You would never thought. And this is right amidst the city in the middle of an industrial area. That's why it used to be a rubbish tip. And now after 30 years, look at it. It's green. It has this is actually a freshwater wetland, and this is actually a saltwater wetland. It's just incredible. And basically every plant has been changed into an indigenous plant. So this is just a little showcase of their top flowering indigenous plants, indigenous to this park plant, that they flower all across the year. And yeah, so these are the plants we used for this study. And then the idea was that the plants were surveyed for pollinator interactions by the community. So we organized a series of workshops. We provided training on how to identify pollinators, guides, resources. And this is a key thing, like the knowledge transfer is what the community wanted. They're like, yeah, I'm willing to survey insects, right? But I want to learn. I want something in return. And in the exchange was all kinds of knowledge that people had from the community, insects they had seen, interactions they were aware of, new things that we hadn't known before. So it was a really kind of fluid, and it evolved with the help of the community. So the slide is just to show you what it sort of looked like. People would mindfully make observations of the interactions with this particular native. This is an Australian indigenous geranium. And then just in the same tone as I've been discussing before, we built the network of interactions. So in this case, I'll run you what the color means. Green means that the plant is indigenous to the park. So these are the plants in green. And the nodes of this network in blue are indigenous pollinators. And then in purple, you have, for us here, what we call non-native pollinators. So obviously, you're familiar with the honeybee. The cabbage white is also non-native to Melbourne, and what we call the European wasp. And so it's really interesting when you can see the findings presented like this, right? You immediately see that it seems like everything interacts with everything, which is good. But at least it's encouraging that most of the interactions, kind of like, yeah, at least more than half, are from indigenous insects. But you cannot avoid, even if you manage just for indigenous plants, you cannot avoid providing for non-indigenous insects. And this, I hope it goes back to that slide where I show you that it is important. It's not black or white. No matter how you manage, you're going to get really complex interactions that are going to be providing for insects. So that's really interesting. Now, this more about the kind of fragmentation, right, that we were discussing before. We had this other study called Linking Nature in the City that was all about improving connectivity. And here's just an example of our maps that we produce. So in this case, if you're of a particular color, you're technically amongst between areas that are connected. And so it kind of shows that if you're in this big pink park over here, you can connect, pollinators can disperse through the park, but they cannot cross this road into this other areas because this road is too wide or has too much traffic. So we included kind of like the traffic and the width of the roads and all the kind of habitat requirements for these pollinators. So obviously, as an example of a blue-banded bee that I'm going to show you next, blue-banded bee is my favorite Australian pollinator. It's the one in the first photo that I showed you before. And I'll show you more photos of blue-banded bees. So I'm going to use blue-banded bees of my example of what I would like to bring back to Melbourne, or I've been trying to bring back to Melbourne with help of a whole bunch of people that are really interested in doing that too. So blue-banded bees occur in this pink patch here. And they occur in this big blue patch here. And then not surprisingly, they occur in this big patch here and this patch here, which is the Westgate Park patch that I showed you before. So yeah, our analysis basically shows that by themselves, they're never going to be able to colonize these patches. They're going to remain isolated because there's too much disruption. There's too much barriers in between. So this got us thinking of, well, how would we connect these patches, right? Say, for example, between this park and this. And so we thought that we could do, for example, a pollinator pathway that could be funded by council. So that means basically planting a whole highway of the plants that the blue-banded bee needs between the two parks, and then having some kind of like wildlife gardening program where people living across this would also plant plants provided by council or grown by community members to reinforce this network. And the dream, of course, was to provide evidence that the blue-banded bee was dispersing between these two parks. So that this is just an idea that occurred to us, but I can only imagine like if any one of you got together and thought, let's try to do something similar and work with government and community and the academic community to make it happen. And now for the last little bit of the talk, I call it where to next. And this is sort of like, okay, how can we demonstrate that whatever ideas you have, whatever actions you take, and they are definitely happening. It's happening all around the world. Greening is a strong force. A lot of people with a lot of different interests are actually bringing plants back into the city, greening, revegetating. There's so many investment on this currently in the world. This is a beautiful example because it was led by a Linda Tegg, which is actually an artist, not a practitioner, not an ecologist, not a local member of government, but actually an artist. And she thought that the best thing to do was to bring this grassland, which is what I was mentioning before, the type of predominant vegetation in Melbourne, right into the middle of the city. So this patch here cannot be more central to Melbourne. This is the center of Melbourne. It's right there in the middle. And all these grass patches were brought into this site for 5 weeks. And I hope some of you can see that it's not only grasses, it's also wildflowers in amongst the grasses. They're more difficult to see. And so, yeah, this installation, art installation, call it, was brought back into the middle of Melbourne for 5 weeks. Now, we had the luxury of being able to do some research on it and to provide evidence. That's what I was saying, like, how can we provide evidence that these greening actions are working? And so we came and we thought, okay, let's just find about insect species. And in green here across the different groups, so we have pollinators and herbivores, predators, parasitoids, and detritivores. Yeah, so this in green here is what is in the background vegetation. What I mean by that is what was here, what kind of insects were in this tree, in this lawn patch here, and this shrubby vegetation here, without the grassland. And that's what you see in green, okay, during those 5 weeks. And then in yellow, you have what is the number of insects that you find when you add the grassland to this? And we were really, really impressed. And I don't know, it might be surprising to some or not, but I think a whole bunch of people were really surprised to see that, the big gaps, the big net improvement in insect biodiversity that the grassland brought. So things like parasitoids, there were like barely no parasitoids in the background baseline vegetation. And when the grassland was here, that went from like 5 to 20 or, thereabouts. And so in any case, for each group, the gap is big. And this grassland really contributed to bring insects into the middle of Melbourne, right? So it prompted all kinds of interesting questions. Where they came from, did they colonize, were they brought in with the grassland, were they incubated, as in were they like little eggs already in the plants and then they hatched when they were there? What we really don't know. So we're doing all kinds of interesting follow-up, but the fact is you can provide evidence that it's working and you can just basically only improve it. So here's another example I'll run really quickly. This one was called the Live-In Pavilion. It was organized by the indigenous community with the idea of showcasing indigenous values and culture. And of course, as part of that, as I mentioned before, that has a strong, strong plant component. So they brought into this site, also very in the middle of Melbourne, they brought in, I think it was 40,000 individual indigenous plants to a site that it was otherwise 100% non-native plants. And so there were events, music, kids dress up as frogs. It was a really beautiful event. And again, we had the opportunity to think, well, they wanted to say we can bring in the plants, but will the plants bring in indigenous insects too? So is that possible? Can we bring in indigenous insects by bringing the indigenous plants? That's why what we wanted to find out. And again, with the network approach, some evidence that that's definitely possible. So this time I'll be quicker about showing you that the green is the indigenous plants. The reds are the non-native plants that were in the site before. So the predominant composition is still pretty much non-native. And this event only lasted 3 weeks. So it was shorter than the other one. But we were capable of, the plants definitely brought in some indigenous component of insects. And I just want to highlight one interaction here, which is these tufted bluebells that brought into the site. They were actually in their flowering during those 3 weeks. So that was really good, well thought. And you can see that it's a unique blue line with indigenous bees. So basically we're showing that in the absence of the bluebell, there would have been no indigenous bees in this site. And that's obviously got everyone involved in this really excited to kind of think, wow, for 3 weeks, and we can bring this insects in just by choosing the plants appropriately. And so the next one that I show you here, and last one I think, is this is called, for short, the Tuner and Molbo Memorial. And so it is a memorial to indigenous culture, again, right in the middle of the city. They basically changed this site from it was a disturbed lawn. So before it was just a lawn here. And these trees were very small and now they have grown. And they brought in, again, a massive amount of indigenous plants representing about 10 or 15 species and did a big greening installation to go alongside this cultural installation, this memorial. And so again, we're working on this site to demonstrate whether it's going to work, whether bringing the plants is going to bring in insect biodiversity. And I'll show you here what we'll be finding. So this time it's permanent. It's not like the other two where it was temporal and they were removed. In this case, we are doing it for 3 years. And I think 2021 is going to be year number 5. So we're going to keep doing this for as long as we can. And then I show you again that same kind of pattern, right? So BL means the baseline, the lawn and the little trees, and greening action is the new things. So of course, in year 0, there's no insects in the greening action. There's only this really depopulated insect community here. And then only after 1 year, when you jump from year 0 to year 1, in blue, you get the insect biodiversity of those plants that were brought into the site. And the change is massive, right? You jump from here, this is before, you jump all the way up to here after. It's so big that a lot of the insects spill over, and then you get more insects in the lawn and the tree that were there before, which then drops as the story goes. And this kind of stabilizes, and then it keeps going because you get more colonization coming through the years, which is expected. So basically after 3 years, you go from say 5 insects on average on a given plant to over 20. And again, so this is the kind of thing that gets everyone excited of thinking, well, this could work, right? And I have added this slide here, which is brand new, it's unpublished, and we're about to submit this to the international community, just to show how the network of interaction of that site works. And so you have seen a few of these through the talk. You have your indigenous plants in green. In white, I left here the plants that were there in the baseline year, in year 0. And I think it speaks by itself. Like if you only have those 2 things, you're gonna get a few interactions with a few insects, but look at how complex, how it grows in complexity and strength when you add all the other plants across such a huge diversity of insects that we have to actually group them in big groups. We can't even have a link for each. We cannot have a node for each insect because it will be untractable. So we have to group them in big groups. And even so, it shows a diversity across the whole kind of tree of life of insects interacting in this site. So it's a really, we're really happy about this. Now I'll finish with this last slide, and in advance, thank you so much for your attention. But I just want to finish with a little story. This is another site where we actually kind of taking the same approach. The amount of greening is much larger. The investment on this park was much bigger, to the point that they themed the park in a way. So they said, they took an abandoned green space and north of the central downtown area of Melbourne, and made a big investment in plants and infrastructure. And they actually thought, we want to bring back blue-banded bees to this park. So we conducted a survey to show that there were no blue-banded bees in the site before. It was almost impossible. There were none of its flowers, nothing was flowering. There was none of the host plants of the blue-banded bee. And they planted on purpose plants, obviously, that were known to attract blue-banded bees in the hopes that to see whether it was targeted. Like, we really want to show that we can bring back one specific insect to this site. And so they were bold enough to theme their park, and the playground is themed around blue-banded bees because they thought, well, this is going to work. So yeah, I was very lucky to be there the first day of the after surveys, when we went back into the site to try to find the blue-banded bees. And this is it. This photo here is it. It was the first flower that I approached, had my camera ready, and there she was. The blue-banded bees had been brought back to this site. And I got my phone out and I texted the practitioner and the council saying, like, say it. You can say it to the world. It worked. You brought back blue-banded bees to this site. You should be really proud and excited. So that's for me. And just thank you so much for your attention. It's always a pleasure to have. And you were so interactive before and really kind with your comments. So thank you. And just special thanks to Michael and Emma for organizing, and for the whole NAT staff for hosting me. So thank you very much.
That was incredible. Thank you, Luis. I know that when I've seen your stuff before, the thing that has blown me away is the interest in buy-in that you're getting at the council level. That is there, like, was that something you had to cultivate? Yeah, I'm just curious about that, because the traditional dynamic, right, is that environmentalists and government butt heads, kind of thing. How did that come to be and cultivate?
No, you're right. There is definitely a tension there. My feeling is that maybe it was just being in the right time at the right, the right place at the right time. I feel that maybe here in Melbourne, that interest of government has shifted. Mm-hmm. I think they have started to employ academics that have moved away from academia. They have started to employ practitioners that want to have a different role in government, a more active role. So I find that it's incredibly amount of switched on, for lack of a better word, a very switched on community and government here.
That's fantastic.
That then when you get to interact with them, good things happen, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so wonderful to hear.